Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today is Dr. Frank Dobbin. He is the Sociology Department Chair at Harvard University and author of a book called Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't. And today's episode is going to be all about DEI, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything about DEI. But before we jump in, first, a big thank you to all the people who are watching, viewing, subscribing. The show's been growing in popularity on Spotify and Apple, so thank you. And if you haven't subscribed there yet, then please do so and share this show with a friend. So, Dr. Dobbin, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. And let me just mention my co-author on this book, Getting to Diversity, is Alexandra Kalev, who's at Tel Aviv University.
Okay, perfect. So much to talk about when we think about DEI. It comes up in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the podcasts where I interview CEOs. When I speak at events, it comes up. It comes up all the time. And I think especially in today's business world, you've probably seen a lot of the news. You have leaders like Elon Musk saying DEI needs to die. You have backlash against universities, backlash against corporate DEI programs. And it just seems like like we're in a collective DEI boxing ring and everyone's just trying to knock the other person out. So I thought we could start very high level with what is DEI? Like when it was developed, when it first became a thing, what was it? What was its intended purpose? And where do you think we are now with DEI? How has it evolved and changed?
Well, I mean, that's a question that I've written another book on called Inventing Equal Opportunity. So I could give you a very long answer, but the quick answer is we started down this path with corporations really taking diversity and inclusion and equality of opportunity seriously in 1961 when John F. Kennedy issued an order for federal contractors to go beyond just making everything race neutral. That order was focused on race and asking them to take positive steps, or what he called affirmative actions, to try to stop existing institutionalized racism. That's what we'd call it today. Existing institutions that prevented mostly Black people, but Hispanic people, Asian American people, from getting into good jobs and firms. And so that system has evolved. The system that companies put into place starting in 1968 has evolved to become what we have now as diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
It's very interesting that it goes back that far because a lot of people don't even think to go back to the 60s when we think about DEI. And I was reading a couple books about, not necessarily DEI, but political books, and they were talking about the Weather Underground. They were talking about critical race theory, Marcuse, Angela Davis, how a lot of these different types of influential actors played a role in some capacity in introducing some of these concepts in various forms, whether you look at critical theory that became critical race theory, whether you look at DEI, whether you look at whatever it is. And just the history of all of this, I think, is very, very interesting. And it does have a lot of connections to, like you said, to the 60s, to politics. So that's where it started in, you said 1961 or 68?
61 was when Kennedy issued this order to all federal contractors. So almost all large companies in the United States had to have a plan in 1961.
Okay. So how did it evolve now? So obviously we're many, many decades later. So how was it, maybe we could talk about how was it received or thought of in the 60s? And how did it evolve? And I know you wrote a whole book on this. Maybe we can give the short version, how it got to where it was in the 60s. And was it actually called DEI in the 60s? And how did it get to where it is now?
I mean, in the 60s, it was mostly called Equal Opportunity Programming or Affirmative Action Programming. It initially only covered race, religion, creed. It later covered gender, starting with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What's interesting, if you look at what companies are doing, is companies were doing many of the same things starting in 1961 that they're doing today. For example, they were doing what they called race relations workshops often, which looks a lot like diversity training today.
Mm,
But if you think about the last 5 years, we've seen real ups and downs in support for DEI programming.
yeah.
So after the murder of George Floyd, we saw a lot of companies really jump on this bandwagon, start to set goals publicly, which many companies had never done. We had some tech companies doing that 15 years ago, but 4 years ago, a lot more companies jumped on that bandwagon. Many Fortune 500
Yeah.
companies set gender goals,
And
race,
now they have DEI officers.
ethnicity.
Most companies have DEI executives.
Yeah, a lot of companies kind of upgraded to chief diversity
Yeah.
officers, even if they had mid-level executives in charge of that. So we saw a lot of positive action, but then we've seen also a very, very dramatic backlash in the last year, particularly after the Supreme Court decision banning affirmative action in college admissions. That case was obviously against Harvard University in North Carolina, but it applied to all universities. So, and that, we. I will say we also had the Proud Boys and other white nationalist groups fighting DEI programming all along, but that's become kind of mainstream in the last year. So you have Greg Abbott in Texas, Ron DeSantis in Florida, trying to end DEI programming in universities and public agencies. In some cases, trying to outlaw it in corporations. So in the last 5 years, we've seen move toward expanding DEI programming, and then real efforts to put the brakes on that. And that's kind of what we've seen all along since the early 60s. We've seen periods when people have really tried to stop movement on equal opportunity, as it was then called, and then periods when they've done a lot to promote it. So one of the things that happened in the 70s is we entered a kind of long period of stagflation, during which a lot of the programs that had been put into place, for example, recruitment programs to try to go to, say, black high schools as well as predominantly white high schools to recruit, historically black colleges as well as white colleges. A lot of those programs had been initiated in the 60s. Then they went away in the 70s when companies weren't needing to recruit anymore. They
Yeah.
stopped recruiting generally, and certainly at historically black high schools and colleges. So we've seen a kind of ebb and flow over time. And that's one of the problems. That's one of the reasons we haven't made a lot of progress on some dimensions. We've been very slow to diversify corporate management,
Okay.
even in the lower levels over time. And that's partly because companies put programs into place, and then there's a recession or something, and they disassemble those programs.
Yeah.
So some of the things that have stuck, like diversity training, are things that don't really work.
So before we talk about what works and what doesn't, I thought maybe we could make arguments for both sides, because I understand both perspectives. I understand, the idea of DEI, as I understand it, is to create a place where any employee can show up and feel like they belong there, and you're bringing in together anyone and anyone, right? It's a mix of everybody, not prioritizing or shouldn't be prioritizing one person or the other, but just making everyone feel like they can apply, belong, work there, kind of get along, different perspectives, things of that nature. So first, why should companies care about that? Why should we care about DEI? Why do we need a DEI officer? Why should we even talk about DEI? Let's say we just deleted all of that from existence. Would anything change in the corporate world, in business, profitability, success? Like, what's the argument for it?
Well, I think there are two common arguments for it. I think the argument, surprisingly to many people in business, the argument that is usually most effective in getting people on board, in getting especially white men on board who don't have an intrinsic interest in seeing these programs flourish necessarily, is that it's the right thing to do. We want to live in a society where everyone has the opportunity to get ahead based on their merits and based on the skills they learn, their innate talents. And the way we the way we allow people to succeed in this society is by making organizations that are fair. Because, when this country was founded, people didn't work in organizations, and you could get ahead by succeeding in the marketplace. But now
Yeah.
almost everybody works in an organization. And so if organizations are creating barriers to success, it means we don't really have a free and equal society. So that's one argument.
Well,
And,
and can we
I think actually,
before you jump into the second one, can we maybe expand on that a little bit? So then, is the assumption that without DEI, that organizations are not fair? Like it's not equal opportunity. It's not like is that the assumption that we should be making about DEI? Is that without these programs, it is not fair inside of an organization. Not everyone gets an equal opportunity, and that these programs are necessary in order for that to happen.
well, so I think it depends what we're talking about in terms of these programs.
Okay.
So for me, DEI programs are programs that simply level the playing field. So programs, for example, almost all corporations recruit at majority white colleges and universities. But few corporations recruit at majority Black and Hispanic colleges and universities. So if you're sending recruiters out to 20 schools, big companies do that, you should include some historically Black and predominantly Hispanic schools too. That's just kind of leveling the playing field. If you
Okay.
want to open up to Black people, you have to go to where they're in college.
Okay. So that
So
makes sense. You're
now
expanding the talent pool.
so the programs that I talk about when I talk about DEI are the programs that are shown to work, and they're almost only programs that just equal opportunity for different groups.
Okay.
So can I give one more example,
Yeah.
or do you
Yeah.
want to
Please.
move on?
Please.
Okay, so take mentoring. So in any organization, it's recognized that mentoring, like having a mentor, is key to success. If you don't have a mentor, you don't have somebody looking out for you, you're not likely to be able to move up. Well, many organizations, including very large organizations, leadership thinks that mentoring has to be natural. That is, you have to have two willing parties. An executive chooses somebody to be their protege. Protege likes the looks of this, and so takes part informally. And, to this day, I get CEOs saying to me, those matches have to be informal, natural. You can't engineer that. Well, the fact is, in most organizations, when you let that happen informally, white men get almost all of the mentoring. And so people of color and women lower down in the organization just don't get the mentoring that they would need to succeed. So a formal mentoring program, which is just open to everybody, it's not usually called a DEI program, just is there to make sure that everybody who wants a mentor gets one. And when companies put those in, they see a lot more diversity in their management teams after about 5 years, because people who weren't getting mentors are suddenly getting them. So the programs that I think of as the programs that are successful DEI programs are a series of programs that just kind of equalize the playing field, democratize access to scarce resources like mentoring.
Okay. And you also mentioned merit. So I'm assuming that the way that you think about, or the way that we should think about DEI, is that the standards don't change. Is that correct? Like the standards don't change. The standards are the same for everybody. We're just kind of expanding our talent pool and making sure that regardless of who you are at the company, you have access to the same resources, whether it's mentoring or coaching, learning and development and training. Everyone has access to these things, but the standards do not change as far as how you're evaluated, what's expected of you, and the results that you are supposed to be producing.
Yeah, absolutely. The standards don't change. Although, sometimes you have to rethink the standards slightly. Like if you only recruited Ivy League schools, you're not going to be approaching people at Hispanic serving schools. And so you're not going to hire many Hispanic employees. And then 10 years later, you're not going to have many Hispanic employees who've moved into management. So if you say only Harvard and Yale and Princeton count, then you're just going to be excluding a lot of people. So I think you have to think about how you define merit sometimes.
Okay. Okay, so that I understand that. So that makes sense. You're expanding the talent pool, making sure that the people that you hire, that everyone has an equal opportunity to be a part of that organization. Once the people who start working there, make sure they all get access to resources if they need it. Now let's talk about any other arguments for, and we talked. So that's you talked about some of the arguments for as far as management and leadership, and I think there have been several studies in terms of the ROI, so to speak, of diverse teams that have been done too. But anything else that you think we should talk about for the pro or for DEI side?
Well, so I started with kind of the social justice. This is the right thing to do.
Okay.
The other main argument that gets made is ROI. So the company is going to be more effective. It's going to produce more value if you have diverse teams. I mean, there's a bunch of evidence for that at the team level, at the micro level, at the business unit level. I honestly, what we see in surveys is that often executives don't think they need to change anything. They think they have the right recipe. They don't think they need a different looking team to be effective. And so I think that argument often doesn't change people's minds. And, I think if you think about how we think about ourselves, what are our important values? Increasing ROI by 2%, does that drive you in life? Probably not,
Yeah.
but something like, can we create a more fair society? Can I treat people equally and help people who've had a hard time get ahead? Can I make sure that people who are the first generation to go to college in their family have access to good jobs, whatever their race or ethnicity or gender? Those are the kinds of things that, at least for Americans, they kind of drive us. Those are our core values.
Okay.
It's one reason I think that that's a stronger case in many cases. It's the thing that really gets people to think, oh, I need to change my organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I talk to CEOs and top executive teams, often they'll say, I don't see how we're going to goose ROI by 2% or 1% by hiring a bunch of different people. So I don't know why I should bother to do that. But when I say, wouldn't you like to contribute to a fairer society, they're usually on board with that.
Okay. Okay, so that's the pro and the for side. Now let's take the opposite perspective, because I think this is what we're starting to see a lot of. And I see a lot of headlines like this that are coming out. And so I think the way that you've described ROI, as far as expanding the talent pool so that anybody can apply to work at the organization, like to your point, instead of just going to Ivy League schools, you go to different types of universities. You make sure that you don't lower your standards, but you make sure that the people who get hired inside the organization have access to equal resources inside the organization. I think a lot of people can get behind that. Now, for the against side, I think at least one of the things that I'm hearing, and this is talked about a lot, and there are people like Christopher Rufo and several others who are chronicling what's happening inside a lot of organizations, and I think this is where a lot of the pushback is coming, is that it feels like in some organizations, DEI has pushed well beyond that. And so, for example, some articles that I was just pulling up fairly recently are, for example, Bank of America teaching employees that the United States is a system of white supremacy. There was an article about Walmart telling workers that they're guilty of internalized racial superiority. Lockheed Martin said that executives are forced to deconstruct white male privilege. You have Disney. You have lots of these types of stories that are coming out, which I think is where all of this backlash is coming. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the intention of DEI, from what we talked about, is something that a lot of people can get behind. But then when we start hearing all these other stories that appear on the other extreme, that seems to be where we get a lot of pushback, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. So first, do you agree? Is that like, have we gone too far in that regard? Like, why are we seeing these types of stories? Like, I mean, isn't it natural that something like that should or would bother people when that kind of stuff comes out?
Well, I think the problem with the way a lot of companies execute DEI is, for one thing, they outsource a lot of the work, so they're not doing it
Yes.
themselves.
Yes.
They're hiring somebody in to do it. They're hiring consultants, and a lot of people
It's become a
in
huge
this realm,
industry, and I think a lot of people don't even
it's
know,
become a
the
big industry.
consultants don't even know what they're doing.
Well, a lot of the consultants aren't, don't know the firms they're working for very well. They don't
Yeah.
know the cultures they're working with very well. Um, but I think a lot of the people doing the work in this domain, although they have the best of intentions, and this includes the executives of a lot of companies, they think that the main problem is individual level bias. So managers are biased, and they think that the way to change that is to convince people that they're biased and get them to change themselves, get them to
Yes.
change their own behavior, get them to stop discriminating, to think twice when they're making decisions. That sounds appealing in a way. Of course, it's nice to have somebody to blame, but talk to any psychologist. I'm a sociologist. Talk to any psychologist or sociologist and ask them whether it's a good idea to try to shame people in order to get them to join your cause. It doesn't work. It always backfires.
Yeah.
Blaming people for problems that exist in their environments, in the organizations they work for, is a bad idea too. It just alienates them.
But how did we
So,
get?
and while there is,
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead. Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well, while there is individual level bias in organizations, we have tried many things to change that. And social scientists have studied this since the 1920s. How do you reduce racial bias and anti-Semitism in particular? Those are the two things they've been looking at most. And you can't do it by training people, and you can't do it by convincing people that they're biased, because people don't believe they're biased or anti-Semitic. They want to believe that they're fair. They want to believe that they're righteous, and you just can't convince people. And if you try to, it will turn them off.
Hmm.
And so the things that you've been discussing are perhaps well-meaning, but very counterproductive approaches to getting people to join this cause.
I
And
just am.
in general, so our research shows that. Oh, go ahead.
No, please. I think there's like a 1 second delay. So no, I'll let you finish.
Well, our research shows that the typical kinds of diversity training offered in corporations today are ineffective. And they're the kinds that blame people by focusing on the law and showing that people are doing things that are probably against the law. And that just turns people off. People who go through that kind of training become more discriminatory, not less.
I guess what I'm having a hard time trying to understand is how did we get to the DEI that you described of expanding the talent pool, making it fair for everybody to get a job at the company, giving people access to equal resources, to some of the headlines that I've read, like about Bank of America, about systemic racism. If you're white inside the organization, you should feel guilty. There was a headline that I read to a previous guest that came out today at UCLA, where it said half of trainee doctors at UCLA's prestigious medical school are failing basic tests after a dean who's anti-white ignored affirmative action ban and terrorized staff with DEI rules. So, so on the one hand, we have the way that you talked about DEI, which I think a lot of people can get behind. And then you have this other extreme that we're reading about and hearing about, whether it's UCLA or Bank of America or Disney. And I just don't know how we got from that one side to why are we hearing these stories? Like, is this just DEI executives who misunderstood things? Is this companies who've just gone too far? Like, do you understand what I'm saying? It's like we went from, we want to create a place where everyone can show up, to we're gonna have quotas and we're gonna make you feel guilty and it's just like crazy how we got from one to the other. And I don't understand how that happened.
Well, I mean, there's always been a tendency in DEI, in diversity training. So all of the examples you came up with are from diversity training.
Yes.
So we've always had a tendency in diversity training to try to shame people and try to get them to admit that they're biased, with the idea, and it's an old idea from really psychoanalysis, that if that people have to recognize their problems and try to address their problems. So you have to first see where your problems lie.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not a way to get people to change this kind of behavior, though, because again, it makes people feel that they're being unfairly blamed for something that they didn't do. And honestly, if you think about what goes on in organizations, it's true that sometimes managers who are making hiring decisions are individually biased, and that shapes their hiring decisions.
Yes.
But a lot of what we do is just we have organizational practices that aren't fully meritocratic, that don't open opportunity to everybody. And if we tweak those by recruiting at historically Black colleges as well as at the Ivy League and flagship state schools, we can make things change. The fact is, if we try to convince people that they're biased,
But it's not even that
we'll get exactly what you're talking about. That is,
yeah, but it's not even that we're
some of the
biased.
trainers will go too far.
Yeah, it seems like it's not even bias. It almost seems like a type of animosity. Like if for example, if I had a full-time job working at a company and I showed up and I was forced to take a class about white supremacy or anything like that, I'd be like, what the hell's going on here? So I don't understand how we have made that leap from let's open up the talent pool, give everyone access to equal resources, to you show up to work and now you're going to be taught that if you're white, you're this, if you're Black, you're that. Like something got lost in the middle, I feel like, to make this jump. And I don't know if maybe it was during the pandemic or during the George Floyd riots where we were so quick to put so many people in DEI roles without making sure that these people knew what they were doing, or they were qualified DEI practitioners, or that, like to your point, we outsourced something to so many consultants and a lot of these people didn't know what they were doing and it became a huge mess. Like how, you know what I mean? Like how do we get from point A to Z over here to this extreme? Because I think a lot of people would get behind the way that you described DEI at the beginning. But also, when people see the stories that are coming out today, that's why you see people like Elon Musk saying DEI needs to die. That's why you see people like Ron DeSantis saying we got to ban DEI from schools. That's why you see this backlash because of this like extreme opposite side. And and maybe somebody who's listening and watching can share their thoughts too, but I just don't know how it got to this extreme level.
Well, I think we have long had a theory that, as I was starting to say, you've got to get people to admit that they're biased and in order for them to address it. But there is no evidence that that works, because people have been trying that in educational situations, in trainings for decades, and people just are not gonna hear that they're biased, and people, even if they're very clearly biased, don't think of themselves as biased. So almost everybody is in favor of meritocracy. Everyone thinks that they make fair judgments about people who work for them, even the people who score on bias tests that psychologists develop as extremely biased. It's also the case that we're now dealing with the idea of implicit bias. So there's widespread evidence that's very common, that we all hold stereotypes, gender stereotypes, age stereotypes, racial stereotypes. It's hard to shake those. You can't train them away. I think what we're dealing with now is just an incorrect theory of how you change the world that has long been proven not only ineffective but counterproductive. And unfortunately, some practitioners, some people who are out there doing diversity trainings are just adhering to this idea that you've got to shame people, and it's a crazy idea. No social science backs that up, but I will say that a lot of the people who are doing this are well-meaning. They think it'll work.
Yeah.
Obviously, they wouldn't do it if they thought it would backfire. But my hope is that what comes out of this moment is more of a focus on the basics. And when I say the basics, I mean, I'm talking about what Lockheed and Marietta, Georgia did in 1961 to comply with John F. Kennedy's affirmative action order for federal contractors. They're building huge planes. They don't want to lose their contract. Kennedy said you have to do something positive. They started going to black high schools, to segregated black high schools. That is, Jim Crow black high schools, and recruiting people for entry-level jobs. They started going to historically black colleges. They started training programs that specifically recruited black trainees as well as white trainees for skilled jobs. I mean, they just started doing the obvious things to open up jobs to people who had been excluded for them. And those are the things that still work today. And anti-bias trainings that blame people for bias weren't working then, and they don't work now.
So it seems like the heart of all of this is a result of shame. We're trying to shame people, make people feel guilty for things that they may think or feel or not even think or feel. And so it sounds like your idea is that that's the heart of what's causing so many problems, is that a lot of companies and a lot of DEI practitioners are approaching DEI from a perspective of let's shame people, let's make people feel guilty. And because they're going to feel guilty and we're going to shame them and embarrass them and whatever, blah, 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 then they're going to change. And so that approach, it seems like, doesn't work. And later on, I'll ask you about how to do DEI correctly. But before we jump into that, I'm actually curious, do you think we need formal DEI programs? Like, why can't you make the argument that if you're doing HR correctly, if you're hiring people correctly, if you're leading people correctly, then the idea of baking all of this into how your company operates and how you hire, it should just be a part of the cake. So why do you need a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer? Why do you need a team or a program? Shouldn't it just be part of how the company operates? Is just the leadership team should say, yeah, we want to expand our talent pool. Yes, we want whoever we hire here to feel like they can do their best work here. Yes, we want everyone to feel like they have access to the resources that we're offering. Why do you need a DEI team? That should just be how the company works, shouldn't it?
Well, I think you're onto something there. I think what we find in our research, and so we look at most of our analyses look at 800 or 900 companies over 50 years. The companies have more than 8 million workers, and we look year to year at what happens after the companies adopt particular kinds of practices. And we look at whether the practices help them to diversify management, which is the hardest nut to crack.
Yep.
And we see that legalistic diversity training tends to lead to reductions in how diverse the management team is, not increases. For some of the reasons we've been talking about, it tends to alienate white men in particular. And those are the people making decisions in most companies right now. But some things that put managers in the driving seat rather than blaming them are hugely effective. So one of the things that's most effective is to create a task force that looks at equity, that looks at merit, and tries to see where there are problems within the organization and what they could do to solve the problems. So this kind of task force, usually the CEO asks department heads to either join the task force or send somebody, send a lieutenant. These people come together. If that group isn't diverse enough, the CEO will add some people from representing different groups. They look at the data. They try to identify problems. They'll see that whatever black employees are being fired at a disproportionate rate without cause and try to figure out why that is. or they'll see that women who are on the fast track will take the second maternity leave and not come back. So they'll try to figure out, well, how do you solve that problem? So they'll look for problems, try to solve them, and then these people will go back to their departments and make sure they're implemented. Like they might implement a mentoring program, and then they go back to the departments, make sure everybody gets a mentor.
But I
So
have
that's a
one
way.
question for you about that. So let's say we go with one of your examples and kind of play devil's advocate. And let's say you do notice something like that. Let's say it's a team of like, I don't know, everyone's a white guy on the team, but the team is performing really well. And then you have somebody coming in from the DEI team that says, hey, everybody on this team is white. We're going to diversify the team. Should the goal be having a diverse team, or should the goal be to have a team that performs at its best and is achieving the goals? And how do you balance those two things? You know what I mean? Because I think that's also tricky. Because if you have a team where you don't have a lot of diversity, but it's doing really well, and then let's say maybe you add diversity and it dips a little bit, or you're adding diversity for the sake of diversity, how do you balance that piece with the merit, with the let's focus on the performance piece? That should be the number one goal, and diversity should just be kind of baked into that. You see what I'm saying? How do you do both of those things?
Well, the situation you described, I mean, it's not what typically happens. For one thing, the DEI team in any organization has no control over who managers hire. So they can't say you have to put together a more diverse team. One of the reasons it's better to have a task force is if you have a task force, then somebody from that department is on the task force. And they go to the meetings and they realize, oh, other departments are managing to hire occasionally a person from another group. And usually they'll go back and say, oh, maybe we send a recruiter to Howard this year. Because they have some amazing econ majors.
So it sounds like you're more asking questions. That's the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I interview a lot of chief diversity officers, diversity managers. They can't tell managers whom to hire. They can't say, quotas are against the law.
Yeah.
So their hands are pretty much tied. They can only suggest, if they're asked, they can suggest, oh, if you want more diverse talent, we could help you figure out where to get it. We have a connection to the Black Accountants Association in your state. So, you want some Black accountants? I think we could do something. So that's why for it to work, honestly, it sort of has to be led by managers, because managers, their last priority is to serve the DEI team. Their first priority is to make their numbers every quarter. They're just not paying that much attention to DEI. So, ironically, these programs, they really only work if you can get top management to be behind them. And one of the best ways is if the CEO puts together a diversity task force where you just get everybody looking at the problem, people looking at the problem who can actually say, hey, let's make sure we get everybody a mentor this year, because there's a bunch of people who are leaving because nobody's looking after them.
What if there was a resource out there that could make you a better leader, that could teach you how to create an organizational culture where your employees are engaged, where you could go to figure out how to create a future-ready organization? Well, good news for you. I put that together on my Substack, which you can find at greatleadership.substack.com. We have tens of thousands of members from around the world who every week are getting access to exclusive CEO interviews, leadership hacks and tips, in-depth guides and articles that I write where I share insights and strategies that I come up with and come across in my ongoing and regular work. So if you want to step up your leadership game, if you want to excel in your career, if you want to create a company where employees are engaged at work, and if you are interested in building a future-ready organization, then head over to greatleadership.substack.com. That sounds so different than what we're hearing what DEI means to a lot of people today. Like, I think if you were to ask a lot of people today, and I don't know if this is just inflated stuff that we see online, but I think if you were to ask a lot of people, hey, what do you think about DEI today? What are you seeing? I think a lot of people would be able to identify some of the anti-DEI arguments that we're seeing. And people will bring up things like, oh, quotas, or they're discriminating against white people, they're doing this, they're forcing this, they're talking about privilege, they're making me feel like. A lot of people, I think, would be able to identify that. Like, that wouldn't be like a foreign concept to them. They would have come across an article or something like that. But the way that you talk about DEI is so different. And like, it almost sounds like the way that you talk about DEI is the way that a lot of people should think about DEI. But the way that a lot of people are thinking about DEI and the perception that DEI has now is not that at all. And I think it's a very interesting difference.
Well, we're in the middle of a bit of a culture war.
Yeah.
And, I will say some of the people who are big promoters of DEI have been kind of culpable for treating the problem as an individual level problem, and as a consequence, acting as if we could just change the bias in people's heads, then organizations would completely change. But ironically, we know from decades of social science research that the way to change the bias, the stereotypes that we all have stereotypes.
Yes.
The way to change them is to put people from other groups working side by side as equals. And it doesn't take long for them to start seeing people from other groups not as members of a different caste or members of a different category, but just as individuals like themselves. And that's, if you want to fight individual level bias, that's the best way to do it, to change what the teams look like. So, ironically, the way to change bias in people's minds is to change what the workplace looks like by recruiting more broadly, by mentoring more broadly, by, one place you were going is by offering skill and management training to anybody who wants it, so that people sign up without being nominated by their mentor, who's person of the same gender and race, by just trying to equalize opportunity within organizations. And exposure to other people, unlike yourself, tends to reduce bias against people from that group in general. One of the issues we have now is, even in organizations that are very diverse, so if you look big picture, you look at, we use Equal Employment Opportunity Commission data at the firm and establishment level. If you look at a firm, usually you've got people from all different groups. The problem is they're not working alongside one another. So logistics is men of color. Finance is Asian American and white men. HR is women of color and white women. And so people actually are not working alongside people who don't look like them. And so they're not getting the kinds of experiences that would cause their own individual bias to be reduced. So I think we're just, based on the social science research, we're kind of attacking this the wrong way.
Yeah.
And, but I hear you. The main problem we have out there now, I think, in organizations generally, when it comes to race relations and gender relations, is we've got some very toxic arguments.
Yes.
And it's arguments that are not allowing groups to talk to one another, which I think is a shame.
Yeah. And somebody can fact check me on this, but I believe when Gallup did their race relations chart, they've been doing this for a couple of decades now. And I think in 2013, most people surveyed, Black and white people, when the question was asked, would you say race relations between white and Black people are very good, somewhat good, bad, or very bad? I think it was the highest positive score that we had in 2013. And since then, we are now at the lowest score that we've ever had, according to the Gallup data, which you would think, and I think this goes to your point of when we focus on shame and guilt, it divides. And I think so much, to your point, even though things have been well-intentioned, it's been pulling people farther apart to the point where you see this Gallup data showing that we're at a period where race relations has never been as bad as it is now, even though you would think with all the investment in DEI, things should be getting better. So it's a very interesting gap.
Well, but part of what we have going on is that we are in the middle of a culture war,
Yes.
and
DEI is right at the middle of that.
You have people like Christopher Rufo who are fanning the flames by exaggerating what DEI programs actually are. They're pretty much toothless and ineffective, and we see very, very slow change in the diversity of professional and management jobs over the last 30 years. Very, very slow change. So, we're not anywhere near seeing something like an equitable allocation of management jobs based on the education levels that Black and Hispanic Americans attain now. So, but there are these people who take any example, for example, of a bad diversity training program, and there are a lot of bad ones out there.
Yes, like Boeing is an example of one.
Blow them up. Yeah, blow them up. And so, and it's easy to get the sense that the whole world has gone crazy.
Yes.
But just because there are some well-intentioned but poorly designed training programs that are really going all out to try to convince especially white men that they're biased and that they're the problem. Well, so I think that approach is misguided, but it is really a minority approach. It's not happening in many workplaces, but some big workplaces have jumped on the bandwagon of, say, Robin DiAngelo, who's one of the people whose idea is that you need to make white people accept their complicity in the bias system we have, and that just backfires.
Yes. Her, Ibram X. Kennedy, we've seen some very extreme versions of this, to your point, which is just not good stuff. But let's transition now for the last 10, 15 minutes or so that we have to talk about how to do a DEI program correctly. So for those listening and watching who are thinking, okay, what's the right way to approach DEI so that we have the impact that we want to have? I'm trying to even add, where would you even begin? So, let's say you're advising some people who are listening or watching, they're thinking of DEI, but DEI in the way that you described it. How would you craft a DEI program that is effective, that is designed correctly, and that has the outcomes that it is intended to have, which are everyone feels like they can show up, we're making everyone have access to the resources that they need to have access to, everyone feels like they belong there, we're getting different perspectives. How would you build that kind of a company? All right, everybody, the rest of that episode, which, by the way, when I stopped recording, I told Dr. Dobbin that was my favorite conversation on DEI that I've had, just because his approach to DEI sounded so sensible and normal and rational, and you hear kind of the opposite extremes. And we were talking about how you have, people like Christopher Rufo on one end of the extreme, and then you have people like Ibram Kennedy and Robin DiAngelo on the other end of the extreme. We're the normal people in the middle. So it was a really fascinating discussion. I hope you grab a copy of this book. But in this bonus episode, the bonus conversation that we're going to have, only available for premium subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts, we're going to talk about how to actually approach DEI correctly. So what is the right way that you and your company should be thinking about DEI. We talked about a lot of the mistakes, a lot of the wrong approaches during our the normal 45 minutes or so conversation. And then we have around 15 or 20 minutes where we talk about how to approach it directly. And he's going to be sharing some of his insights based on research that he's done. So I'm sure that you'll get a lot of value out of this if your company is thinking about DEI, doing DEI, or maybe even thinking about canceling your DEI initiatives. Make sure to listen to this bonus conversation first. And of course, you can head over to greatleadership.substack.com, subscribe to the email newsletter there to get notified whenever we have new podcasts that are available. I'd also love to hear your comments on these types of episodes. I'm trying to challenge guests more, push guests more, question them more, and play devil's advocate a little bit to try to push them a little bit. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Let me know, what did you think about this episode in particular? I loved it. I learned a ton. Hopefully you did as well. And if you enjoyed the episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thank you so much for watching and for tuning in, and I will see you next time.